Welcome to Outside Views, and I want to talk today about a political situation that is so drenched in irony, so perfectly absurd, that it should be taught in history books as the ultimate illustration of short-sighted nationalism collapsing under the weight of global reality. And the core of the issue is this. Britain, having championed a chaotic and destructive exit from the European Union, is now scrambling to restore a formal sector-specific trade pact with the very bloc it left. And they are doing so in the steel sector, the birthplace, the literal seed cell of European integration. It's an almost unbelievable twist of fate, a desperate attempt to stitch back together the institutional fabric that was so carelessly torn apart. And my strong personal view is that this situation exposes the entire Brexit project for the monumental economic disaster it has proven to be, confirming that taking back control was never about smart sovereignty, but about reckless self-harm. And let's be absolutely clear about the historical weight of this moment. In 1951, the desire to end ruinous competition and secure lasting peace in Europe led to the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community, the ECSC. And this wasn't just a trade deal. It was the fundamental first step, the birth of the European project, the very thing the UK voted to leave behind. 75 years later, we are witnessing the profound irony of the United Kingdom trying to reattach itself to that seed cell of European cooperation, all because its steel industry is now facing imminent catastrophic tariffs imposed by the EU. And the reason for this desperation is simple. Almost half of all British steel exports, a staggering amount, goes directly to the European Union. Following Brexit, the UK lost the right to coordinate trade policy with the EU, meaning that when Brussels acts to protect its own industries, the UK steel sector is treated like any other foreign competitor, facing massive tariffs. Currently, the European Commission is planning to impose potentially crippling 50% tariffs on steel imports to shield European producers from a flood of cheap subsidized steel from China. For British producers, this would be an economic death sentence, a complete closing of their most important market, and that overnight. And the irony is not just that they are seeking cooperation, it is that the UK is now being directly punished by the very independence it so loudly proclaimed. And not punished by the EU, as some Brexiteers want to put that now. I'm quite sure of that. It's a third country, so rules for all third countries, like China, also apply to other third countries like the UK. And the UK government, facing the immediate destruction of a vital domestic industry, is now pressing frantically for a special arrangement with the EU, or better yet, a closer coordinated Western Steel Alliance. Western Steel Alliance, yeah, we have one of those. It's called EU. The proposal being discussed is a steel club of Western democracies, potentially including the United States, that would collectively agree on common customs guidelines and offer preferential trading conditions to members. And this is not global Britain negotiating fantastic new trade deals with distant exotic partners. This is begging Britain, desperately asking to be let back into a trade arrangement that is functionally identical to the one they willingly walked out of. And the goal, according to the British government spokesperson, is to find a global solution against overcapacities. But, guys, let's not be naive. The real immediate goal is to protect British exporters from those devastating EU tariffs, which are an inevitable consequence of the UK's independent trade policy, and so in the end is just another attempt of cherry-picking. And this desperate maneuver exposes the fundamental political flaw of the entire Brexit campaign. The belief that the UK could somehow decouple itself from its largest trading partner without consequence, and then miraculously negotiate better terms than it had before. And this idea was always a fantasy built on a complete ignorance of global trade realities. And the steel sector is a perfect case study in this profound error. Global markets today are not defined by the cozy post-war agreements of the 20th century. They are defined by the aggressive subsidized state capitalism of China, which floods the market with cheap excess capacity, driving prices down and threatening the existence of Western producers. To counter a global threat like this, you need scale, coordination, and unified tariffs. You need to operate as a massive single economic bloc. By leaving the EU, the UK voluntarily reduced its scale and surrendered its seat at the table where crucial trade defenses were decided. It traded economic power for the illusion of sovereignty. The head of the industry body UK Steel, that's Gareth Stace, is now highlighting the chances that a joint approach offers, saying a coordinated steel pact could protect British exports and reduce global price pressure. Well, he is absolutely right, but the sheer frustration of his words, even when couched in optimistic business speak, should be audible. They are now celebrating the possibility of regaining the kind of coordinated trade protection and market access that they enjoyed automatically as a member of the EU. They are fighting to establish a complex, bespoke international treaty to achieve what they lost with the stroke of a pen on the day the transition period ended. And this is not an example of taking back control and using new freedoms. It's an embarrassing, costly attempt to clean up a political mess created by incompetent ideologues like Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage. We should not forget that guy. And the UK is now forced to run around the world with cap in hand, asking to be included in trade arrangements that it once was a foundational member of. And not the ESC, the steel community that Britain joined later, but you all know what I mean. But the irony of this historical full circle moment can just not be overstated. The very first treaty that created the ECSC was about pooling sovereignty over coal and steel production to make the continent secure and competitive. And now, 75 years later, the UK is rushing back to pool sovereignty, or at least coordinate trade defenses, over the exact same commodities for the exact same reasons, to fend off ruinous global competition. And furthermore, this whole sorry episode is a massive indictment of the political integrity of the architects of Brexit. They consistently promised that the UK would be able to easily replace the EU market with new deals, and that trade with the continent would continue seamlessly. The reality is that UK exports are now falling behind those of the G7 average, and every major export sector, from cars to chemicals to food, has slumped in relative terms. And this plea to reinstate a steel pact is the latest, most humiliating sign that the UK cannot survive, let alone thrive, in the shadow of the EU without some degree of formal managed cooperation. It shatters the political pretense of a clean, unproblematic break. The political dynamics in Brussels are also fascinating and telling. EU representatives are reportedly fundamentally open to talks. And this openness is not an act of kindness, it's a calculation. Because the EU knows two things. First, that a sudden collapse of the UK steel sector due to EU tariffs would create a political and economic headache on the continent, potentially involving a sudden influx of cheap steel and complicated regulatory issues. Second, they know that the UK, in its desperate weakened state, is now more pliable and willing to align with EU regulations than ever before. The EU and the UK are already coordinating on their planned carbon border taxes on steel imports, an act of regulatory alignment that completely undermines the sovereignty argument of the Brexiteers. The EU is effectively leveraging the UK's post-Brexit fragility to ensure alignment where it matters most, further exposing the hollowness of the Take Back Control slogan. The UK is now in the unenviable position of having to accept regulatory and trade alignment without having any say in the legislative process that creates those rules. It is the ultimate vassal-state arrangement, and it's a situation directly engineered by the ideological delusion that fueled the decision to leave. And this entire saga, the return to the seed cell of the European project, should be a moment of deep, painful reflection for the entire British political establishment. It's an object lesson in how a complex, interdependent modern economy cannot be magically separated from its largest trading partner without severe, immediate and lasting damage. The pursuit of a Western steel alliance is a necessary survival mechanism for the industry, but it is a monumental political failure. It confirms that the economic realities of global trade and the necessity of unified action against threats like Chinese overproduction have forced the UK to reverse course, seeking to reconstruct the very regulatory and trade unity it spent years destroying. And this is not a story of a nation finding its independent path. It's a story of a nation realizing the path it took was a costly, damaging detour, and now, bruised and broke, it's desperately trying to find its way back to the main highway. Or, for you, I would say motorway. The irony of history is palpable, but the economic cost to the UK is tragically real. The UK wanted out of the European club. Now, the world's harsh realities are forcing it to beg for a special membership for the one thing that started the club in the first place. It is, quite frankly, pathetic. So thanks for watching, and if you want to see another video right now, the next one is right here in the end screen.